It's Thursday, April the 4th, 2013. You're listening to The Mind Whisperer on Blog Talk Radio. I'm your host, Michael Gordon. Welcome to the program. Today we're going to be talking about codependence versus interdependence, exploring that topic and getting to the root of matters. All right, well, let's jump right into the program today. Little experiment today. I'm also videotaping the show for archive purposes on YouTube, so look forward to your comments on that. If it doesn't eventually make its way up onto YouTube, we'll start a YouTube channel for the Mind Whisperer. And for those of you tuning in for the first time, welcome to the program. This is a program about spiritual psychology in daily life. And my name is Michael Gordon. I am your host. And this is the Mind Whisperer program. And we're looking at all range of topics deal with applying a spiritual psychology. And what does that mean? That means that we're looking at psychology not necessarily in the pathological sense, but in a blend of scientific and philosophical or spiritual understanding of how we live our lives and the meaning of our lives. Really, that's really what spirituality is about. Is looking at the meaning that we derive out of our lives and how we frame our existence. I got all kinds of phone calls going off at the moment. So let's get right into the topic today. Sorry for the distraction. Codependence versus interdependence. What does that mean? Well, when we look at the issue of codependence, let's get the definition going first of all. Codependence is a term that is generally used in the addiction recovery movement. And codependence is a very oft misquoted term that people mistakenly believe to be actually interdependence or dependency. And in the sense that I'll use a context so that my partner and I are too codependent on each other. And what they mean is that we are dependent. We're each dependent on the other, overly dependent, which is not necessarily a completely incorrect definition of the term, but in context of what codependency or codependence is meant to describe the dynamic in that situation, it doesn't really get quite specific enough to the enmeshment of that dynamic. I'm going to speak to that in just a moment. So in terms of addiction recovery, codependence is a term that really is identifying a dysfunctional relationship between one party in a relationship and, let's say, a spouse of an addicted or alcoholic spouse. And so the user sets up this very compulsive type of behavior on the part of the non-user, in that it's triggering their predilection to caretake and going right to the core of their insecurity, that their self-worth or their anxiety is triggered by the well-being of the other person in the relationship. And of course, that other person being unstable and being out of control with substance abuse, it creates this very negative spiral for each of them. And so they escalate each other's issues. And so the term in addiction recovery or alcohol recovery is enabling. So it's very enabling of the other person's behavior, and you start feeding off of each other. So this is, in essence, what codependence is. Now, because it's dealing with dependency on a substance, or dependence, I should say. So now, when we look at that dynamic, we can see that being very pervasive in interpersonal relationships, particularly in love or intimate relationships. And this goes back to a theme that's been a constant running through this program over the episodes since last year, looking at this idea of enmeshment. And this is essentially kind of an arrested development or legacy, a negative legacy of childhood, where we don't develop whole and autonomous boundaries or an ego boundary from other people, particularly from our parents. And the idea is that when you are truly dependent as a organism, as a conscious young person, um, there are incremental stages socially and emotionally where you start to develop the capacity and the tolerance, really, for forming relationships outside of that dependent circle of your family unit. And as you do that, you start to build again this tolerance and this strength of character and the appropriate skills and boundaries to interact with the world without being completely dependent and sheltered by your parents. So if this doesn't occur, in a natural process through leaving the nest, coming back periodically to go to preschool or whatever it may be to learn to be socialized, then what happens is we become overly attached to our parents in an insecure way, and whatever interference, if you will, in a noise-like way, in kind of a white noise kind of way, that's occurring in that family unit, we habituate or identify or even internalize messages and our environment such that our identity is and our neurological development are all intertwined with this enmeshed family unit. And therefore, when it comes time to actually leave that family unit, because we do have to be adults if we're not physically dependent on our parents with some kind of mental or physical cognitive disability, then we have to go out into the world and we have to work and be our own autonomous people. And we start to really develop that in late adolescence when we have our own independent thinking, and we've emerged from those early developmental stages where we have what's called split thinking or polarized thinking, black and white thinking of childhood. And so we get into the rational reasoning developmental stage of late adolescence, and we are capable of going out in the world and interacting with the world. And we still may have the parents in the background to support us emotionally or even financially, materially, but we're our own people and we're discovering our own way in the world. And so all of society, civil society, is really structured around that. And school and post-secondary education or the trades are all there to help us emerge as adults. The problem is if we've emerged with that, those kind of dysfunctional internalized interferences, then we become very wired to the idea that of being dependent on others, and kind of anxiety that goes with being on our own. And the more pronounced aspects of that is if there was narcissism present in our parenting early on, and indeed even further than that, actual alcoholism or addiction, then the child is forced to adapt to an environment where they're caretaking their parents. There's a role reversal. And that's what I mean by narcissistic. I don't just mean arrogant, but narcissistic in the sense that the parents are self-centered and neglectful of the needs of the child who's supposed to come first. And so that sets a person up to be very anxious and very hyper-attenuated to the need of somebody else. Also, they're going to be just predisposed to being drawn to somebody else who is not paying attention to them as a sort of compulsive projection of their own early issues. So we have this very calamitous setup of circumstances to play out those early patterns and to reinforce that hypervigilant state that goes with always on the lookout of caretaking another. And so this is really, the structure and core of what we mean by codependence. You become dependent on the caretaking of another person who is not taking care of themselves. And you can see the downward spiral that is really set up by those circumstances to be to the detriment of both parties. And so interventions, for example, in families or couples where there is a codependence issue, by definition, requires the sort of sobering up of the non-user party, the codependent spouse, to recognize that they're actually enabling the other person. Because there is this fantasy that somehow you are saving the other person, that you are keeping them alive by allowing them to use, and that's a form of love. And in fact, when you look at it in an objective way as a therapist or an interventionist, you see that you're able to see, because you're not enmeshed with that person, that although that may be an altruistic or even a deep-seated kind of pathological compulsion to help the person, in reality, what you're doing is just creating an open door for them to keep using. There's safe haven for them, and even money and finances and emotional support to actually keep them stuck as an addict or an alcoholic. It's a very, very difficult dynamic to work with. Now, if we look at that in contrast to what a healthy dynamic looks like in a family or in a couple situation, then we get into what we would call interdependence. And interdependence is very different. Interdependence means that there is something very functional and very adaptive and very much in line with how we're socially organized and how we are wired socially and neuroanatomically as human beings towards cooperation and mutual care and bonding and attachment, and not just with an intimate partner, but in tribe, in the tribe or in the clan or the family unit. And you can see this in higher primates. I've talked about this before in the program, where there was research shows that higher primates evolved to have a neocortex very similar to ours because of the social organization that allowed, and safety, which allowed for longer gestation period. And the longer gestation period was allowed for because there was more of the group available and organized to protect the mother, and also to protect the mother and child postnatal, and also to be involved in childbearing. And so that environment allowed a longer gestation period, which allows a bigger brain to grow. And then, of course, the brain grows also symbiotically with the attachments with other members of the social clan, the tribe. And so this is really a metaphor, in terms of human organization and our social structure and our social and philosophical aims as a society to be more enlightened and to have a more civilized society based on moral and ethical principles. So that if we see it as a mutual benefit to one another, that we are involved in each other's care and well-being collectively as a family, much like a family unit, but on a regional or global scale, then we have what's called interdependence. And it's based on the motivation of myself being whole and wanting others to be whole as well. That my welfare and my well-being is tied to the well-being of others. And this is certainly something that's expressed in a more compassionate, to use an unfortunate but convenient term, a socialistic kind of view of the world. And socialism is something that's gotten very negative connotations because of how it emerged in the 20th century as being a nationalistic movement, and of course in Italy and even in Nazi Germany, and of course the Soviet Union, and expressed itself in sort of the modern industrial imperial state. But if you look at the core of what the principles of socialism is, it is the benefit of all, that there's an interdependence of that society. And in Canada, for example, here we have what's called socialized medicine, which means that it's a universal right to any Canadian citizen, regardless of wealth or status in society, that every individual has the right to basic health care and medical care. And so we can look at this on coming back to the crucible of relationships, of just say of an interpersonal relationship, of a family unit, of a couple, where if those individuals have healed their childhood wounds, whatever dysfunction and maladaptations they had from their family unit, and what they learned and internalized as negative messages about themselves, or ways that they had to adapt to arguing their way in a big family, or whatever it is. There's all kinds of manifestations of that. Or maybe they grew up in a healthy family with healthy attachments and came out with an intact self-esteem, God forbid. There are people like that. I don't see them in my practice. And we all have to work on those, basic kind of issues of working out boundaries with one another. But if you're relatively healthy, then you are operating for more interdependence, and that is something that can be nuanced and improved and worked on in a relationship, where you have a tolerance and in fact a heightened sense of connection and attachment to the other person because they are independent of you, which is anathema or opposite to the dysfunctional dynamic, which is that you're still operating with that infantile kind of attachment that the other is you. And if the other is not attending to your needs, then there's something wrong. Or you reverse that around, and if the other is not well, then there's something you've done or you need to do. It's sort of a compulsive, caretaking, enmeshed dynamic there, which is the codependence. So I'm just framing this all theoretically for you all to get a better understanding of what that term means and what the antidote is. And the antidote is I take care of me. I don't expect you to take care of me. But I'm capable of letting you take care of me because you're not going to destroy me if you take care of me. And it doesn't mean that I'm weak or powerless. It means that I'm allowing myself to be loved. And in return, that can be exchanged and reciprocated in a healthy way when it comes to time where you need to be loved and be taken care of. And taking care of is different than caretaking. Caretaking is, by definition, an assumptive role where you, again, are operating from some kind of superior or inferior position with the person. And it's worth noting there as well that in that kind of enmeshed dynamic, where one is not operating from an intact sense of self-worth, the more someone tries to help them, the more they lash out, because they're not able to accept that love and that caretaking because it runs counter to what they had to grow up with and survive, which was probably the opposite. So all that said, looking at relationships and why relationships are so difficult and why we have a 50% higher divorce rate, it's easy to see now that we're coming in ill-equipped. We don't understand the dynamics. And before we realize that we picked a partner or we've replicated the dysfunctional dynamics of childhood in our relationship and in the person that we've chosen. And so there's a guiding principle here that to identify what codependence really is and to stop enabling each other's bad behavior and victim-like behavior or a need for revenge or whatever these expressions of powerlessness are, and to really take responsibility. And that means to always look at yourself, which is a lot harder. But if you're always driving it back towards yourself and what you've done and what you may, in a healthy way, and that's again reciprocated, each partner is doing that, then you have a healthy self-exploration and a partnership based on self-exploration and self-awareness and cooperation, interdependence. And depending on each other is not a bad thing as long as it's not based on that kind of unhealthy dependence. That's what a couple is in a relationship, is they've got an interdependent, that in other words, a dependent, but they're each dependent on each other for love and support and finances and parenting and all these things. So dependence doesn't have to be a dirty word. It can be something that fuels your relationship, your appreciation, your motivation to do better and to be a more cooperative and more giving partner and a more receiving partner. Well, once again, the show has been very packed full of theoretical and hopefully some practical information there to think about and take back to your relationships. And as always, it's been my pleasure to host the program. You can listen to the archived program anytime on blogtalkradio.com/The Mind Whisperer. We also have a Facebook page and a Twitter account, which are also on the Blog Talk Radio homepage for the program. Please do join the Facebook page and follow us on Twitter. We appreciate having you along, and we look forward to seeing you on the next program.